She just wanted to clean out her grandfather's old garage. But what Amelia Thompson found hidden in the dust wasn't junk. It was a WWII pilot's helmet, one that shouldn't even exist, belonging to a man who was declared missing in action over the Pacific in 1944. How did it end up in a forgotten garage in Oregon? What secret had her quiet, gentle grandfather carried for nearly 60 years? This isn't just a story about war. It's about a legacy buried in silence and the granddaughter who uncovered it all. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. Her name was Amelia Thompson, a quiet young woman in her early 30s who had spent most of her life tucked away in the bustling suburbs of Portland, Oregon. But when her grandfather passed away that fall, something in her heart told her to go back to the sleepy little town of Ashwood, nestled between fading pine trees and memories that refused to stay buried. Amelia hadn't been to her grandfather's cabin in years. Life, work, and excuses had piled up, like the dust that now blanketed the garage she was tasked with cleaning. He was a quiet man, her grandfather Walter Thompson, a retired mechanic who rarely spoke about the past. Just the sound of his old radio humming Sinatra and the clink of tools was enough to fill the silence. That morning, with clouds hanging low and the smell of damp wood in the air, Amelia opened the creaking garage door. She wasn't prepared for the wave of memories, and she certainly wasn't prepared for what she was about to find, something tucked away in the shadows, hidden beneath decades of dust and silence. A helmet. But not just any helmet, one that shouldn't exist. The helmet was old, the kind of old that whispered stories without saying a word. Its leather straps were cracked with time, the metal slightly rusted, but still solid, still proud. A faded emblem was painted on the side, a golden eagle with outstretched wings, barely visible now. Amelia held it in her hands, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just any helmet. It was a WWII fighter pilot's flight helmet, unmistakably military. But her grandfather had never served, or at least, that's what she'd always been told. She turned the helmet over, gently brushing off the grime. Inside, written in faded ink along the inner rim, were the words, Lawton, James R. Whitmore, 1944. The name hit her like a gust of cold wind. She sat down on an overturned crate. The silence in the garage suddenly heavy. Who was Whitmore? And why was his helmet in her grandfather's garage? She pulled out her phone and searched the name. Within seconds, she found him a young airman from Illinois, listed as missing in action during a mission over the Pacific in 1944. Presumed dead. No body ever recovered. No wreckage ever found. Her stomach turned. Why would a pilot who disappeared over the ocean have his helmet end up in a garage in rural Oregon? The more she tried to make sense of it, the more her hands trembled. She looked around the garage now with different eyes. Suddenly, every tool, every shelf, every drawer was a possible hiding place for answers. She dug deeper. Old boxes, rusted ammo tins, yellowed envelopes, piles of dusty newspapers. After nearly an hour of searching, she came across a small wooden chest tucked behind an old workbench, something she was sure hadn't been opened in decades. The lock had long since rusted shut, but the wood gave in to gentle force. Inside were dozens of old photographs, black and white, faded, fragile. Some were clearly of her grandfather, much younger, in his 20s, smiling with a group of men she didn't recognize. But one photo stopped her cold. In it, her grandfather stood next to a man wearing that same helmet. It was James R. Whitmore. Same eyes, same smile, Same emblem on the jacket sleeve, and scrawled on the back of the photo, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were the words, "Saved me when no one else could." Amelia felt tears rise. She had never known her grandfather as someone involved in any kind of war effort. He'd been a mechanic. Sure, but he'd never once talked about flying, about rescuing anyone, or about knowing any soldiers. He was the kind of man who kept his head down and his stories to himself. But this was a secret buried for nearly 80 years. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She laid the helmet on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might start talking. Her mind was racing. Could it be that her grandfather had rescued this pilot? Had they crossed paths in some forgotten forest? Did he help hide him, feed him, save him? And why had he never told anyone? The next morning, she drove into town, clutching the photograph and helmet like fragile relics. The local library was quiet, almost sacred, and the librarian, an older man named Eli Parker, who had lived in Ashwood his whole life, perked up when she mentioned her grandfather's name. "Walt Thompson," he said, rubbing his chin. Kept to himself. "Good man. Worked on every engine in this town at some point or another. Why do you ask?" She showed him the photo. Eli went still. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "That's the pilot. Isn't it folks talked about a crash way back during the war? Government never confirmed it, but there were rumors. Folks heard something go down in the woods, but nobody ever found wreckage. Some said Walt was acting strange that winter, like he knew something he wasn't saying." Amelia's heart pounded. Her grandfather had been part of something much bigger than anyone realized, and had never once breathed a word of it. She felt a tear roll down her cheek. Not from fear, not from confusion, but from awe. Her quiet, humble grandfather, the man who taught her how to change oil, who made the best grilled cheese sandwiches, who whistled while fixing lawnmowers, had carried a war hero's memory on his shoulders for nearly a lifetime. Not out of pride, but out of duty. And somehow, the truth had waited all these years to be found by her. Back at the cabin, Amelia couldn't stop staring at the photo. The look in Whitmore's eyes. The way he stood beside her grandfather, it wasn't a casual photo. It was something deeper, respect, brotherhood, maybe even a shared trauma. That night, a storm rolled in. Thunder groaned in the hills like something ancient waking up. Rain battered the roof, and the wind howled through the pine trees outside. Amelia sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp lighting the photo and the helmet that now sat before her like relics from another lifetime. And then something strange happened. A knock at the door. Her heart skipped. It was nearly midnight, out here in Ashwood. No one ever knocked past sunset. She hesitated, then opened it. A man in his late 60s stood under a soaked, wide-brim hat. He held an old leather satchel, his hands trembling slightly from the cold. "Are you Amelia Thompson?" he asked, his voice low and worn. "Yes. I'm sorry to come so late. My name's Matthew Whitmore. James Whitmore was my father." Amelia's knees nearly gave out. He stepped in slowly, looking around like he'd just stepped into a museum he hadn't visited since childhood. His eyes landed on the helmet, and everything in him seemed to freeze. "I never thought I'd see that again," he whispered. They sat in silence for a moment before he spoke again. And when he did, his voice shook with a mixture of grief, reverence, and wonder. "My father crashed somewhere near here. That much I knew. He was flying a reconnaissance mission in late 1944. Lost radio contact over the Oregon coastline. Everyone assumed he went down over the ocean. But I always felt that wasn't the whole story." He opened the satchel and pulled out an old journal, battered, almost falling apart. Inside were handwritten entries. "My father never spoke of the war much, but before he passed, he gave me this, said I should read it when I was ready. Amelia leaned in, her pulse quickening. Matthew turned to a particular page, then began to read aloud. December 3rd, 1944. I should have died. My plane went down in the Cascades. Don't know how I survived the crash. But I did. Broken leg, cracked ribs. I crawled for 2 days before passing out in the snow. I woke up in a cabin. A young man had dragged me there. Didn't ask who I was, didn't ask questions. He just saved me, fed me, fixed my leg. We barely spoke, but he stayed by my side through the storm. He said his name was Walt Thompson. He risked everything for me. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. Matthew's voice broke as he read the final line of that page. When I asked why he helped a stranger, Walt just said, "You looked like someone worth saving." The storm outside seemed to hush for a moment, as if the forest itself was listening. Amelia whispered, "He never told anyone, not even my mother. I don't think he wanted recognition. He just kept it in his heart." Matthew nodded slowly. My father tried to find him after the war, but Walt had moved, changed addresses. He gave up. But he always told me that the best man he ever knew wasn't wearing a uniform. They sat in silence for a long time. Two children of forgotten men, united by a story that had been buried by time and silence. Then Matthew reached into his bag once more. He pulled out a small, folded American flag yellowed with age. "My father wanted this returned to the man who saved his life. Since Walt is gone, I think it belongs to you now." Amelia accepted it with shaking hands. It felt heavier than cloth. It felt like legacy. Outside, the rain eased. The first hint of dawn touched the trees. In that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just a discovery anymore. It wasn't just about a helmet. It was a resurrection. A story silenced by war, lost to time, had found its way home not through medals or headlines, but through a granddaughter who chose to dust off the past. And through a knock on the door, one final chapter was written. Together, they decided this story couldn't remain hidden any longer. For most of her life, Amelia Thompson believed that her grandfather, Walt, was just a simple man, a humble mechanic, a quiet soul with grease-stained hands and a stoic heart. She thought of him as steady and kind, but ordinary. Not someone who would be part of a story larger than life. But in the days that followed her discovery, that image shattered not in a way that hurt, but in a way that awakened something deep inside her. After Matthew Whitmore left the cabin that morning, Amelia couldn't stop rereading the journal he had shared. Every sentence felt like a doorway into her grandfather's secret world, a world of silent heroism, of risks taken without reward, of sacrifice without recognition. The man who had taught her how to skip rocks, who carved her name into the old oak swing in the backyard, who once fixed her bicycle at midnight because she was crying over missing a birthday party. That same man had risked his life for a stranger during a time when the world was on fire. And he had never told a soul. It changed everything. Amelia found herself questioning what else she had missed, not just about her grandfather, but about people in general. How many stories go untold? How many quiet acts of courage disappear because the people behind them aren't interested in applause? One afternoon, she stood in the garage again, sunlight spilling through the open door. The helmet was now displayed in a glass case she'd cleaned and restored herself. Beside it sat the photograph and the folded flag from Whitmore's family. It had become something of a shrine, not just to a moment in history, but to a man she was only now truly beginning to understand. She looked at the photo and whispered, "You weren't just fixing engines. Grandpa, you were holding the world together in your own quiet way." Later that week, Amelia decided to visit the Ashwood Historical Society, a modest building near the edge of town. Inside, she met with Margaret Ellis, the town's longtime historian, a woman in her 70s with silver hair tied in a bun and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. Amelia told her everything: the helmet, the journal, the crash, the rescue. She expected Margaret to be surprised, but the older woman just smiled knowingly. "I always had a feeling about Walt," Margaret said softly. "He was gentle, but he had this sadness in his eyes, like he'd seen something and decided to carry it quietly for the rest of his life." Amelia sat across from her, stunned. "Why didn't anyone ever ask him?" "We did," Margaret said. "He'd just smile and change the subject. That was Walt." Amelia stared down at her hands. "I wish I'd known." Margaret reached across the table and took her hand. "You do now? And maybe you're meant to be the one to tell it." That sentence stuck with her. For weeks after, Amelia dove headfirst into researching the story, not just the war, not just the missing flight of Lotto, Whitmore, but the countless acts of unacknowledged bravery that shaped small towns like Ashwood. She interviewed neighbors, dug through dusty archives, and reached out to military historians. Piece by piece, a story emerged. In December of 1944, a reconnaissance plane went missing from the 54th Fighter Group. No crash was reported, no remains recovered. But locals remembered a loud explosion in the forest that winter. Some recalled seeing Walt disappear for several days, returning with frostbitten hands and hollow eyes. No one ever pressed him for answers. It was all circumstantial until Amelia returned to the woods. One crisp morning, guided by an old journal map and Matthew Whitmore's memory of his father's story, Amelia hiked into the dense pine forest behind the cabin. And there, beneath decades of overgrowth and silence, she found it. A single piece of aircraft metal, half buried beneath moss and roots, bearing the faint serial number of the missing plane. Her hands trembled. This was real. She fell to her knees, tears slipping down her cheeks. The forest was quiet, but her heart thundered. This wasn't just about the helmet anymore. It was about validation, proof, closure not just for the Whitmore family, but for her grandfather's legacy. When she returned to town, Amelia made a decision. This story wouldn't die in silence like so many others. She contacted a journalist in Portland, and within weeks, the story of Walt Thompson's wartime rescue hit the headlines. Small-town mechanic revealed as unsung. I'm big for toy hero. Letters poured in, veterans' families, historians, even a retired general who had flown with Whitmore sent his gratitude. Amelia received dozens of messages, but one stood out from a young man in Georgia. My grandfather also helped someone during the war. He never talked about it either. Your story helped me understand him better. Thank you. That was the moment it all came full circle. Amelia realized her grandfather's silence wasn't about shame or secrecy. It was about humility. He didn't need monuments. He didn't want praise. He just wanted someone to survive. That realization changed her, forever. She began volunteering at the local Veterans Center, helping record oral histories. Every story mattered now. Every quiet voice deserved a chance to be heard. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms in public. They wear oil-stained overalls, they fix broken things, and they carry the weight of extraordinary kindness in complete silence. And sometimes, their granddaughters are the ones who finally tell the truth. The day the article about her grandfather went live, Amelia didn't expect much. Maybe a few local readers. Maybe someone from town would send a kind word. She didn't expect her inbox to crash. Emails flooded in hundreds in the first 2 days alone. Veterans from every corner of the country reached out. Families who had lost someone during the war. Children and grandchildren of servicemen who had always wondered about their family's missing pieces. Some just wrote to say thank you. Others had stories of their own long-silenced whispers of bravery, compassion, and sacrifice that had never been told. But one message stood out. It came from a professor at the University of Colorado, Dr. Hannah Reyes, a historian specializing in unsung wartime efforts. She wrote, "Amelia, what you've uncovered is more than a personal legacy. It's a national story, a testament to the quiet heroes history tends to forget. I'd love to talk about helping you preserve this not just for your family, but for future generations." At first, Amelia hesitated. She wasn't a historian. She was just her grandfather's granddaughter. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized maybe that was exactly what qualified her. Because this wasn't just about research, it was about heart. She and Dr. Reyes spoke over video call that week. The professor was warm, engaged, and visibly moved by the story. By the end of the hour-long conversation, she offered Amelia a spot as a guest contributor in a special museum exhibit the university was curating, one titled "The Silent Backbone: Untold Acts of Courage in WWII." Amelia's story and Walt's helmet would be at the center of it. It was overwhelming, but it was also right. And then came the second opportunity. A television producer from a national documentary series reached out. They had read the article and wanted to feature Walt Thompson's story in a special segment on unknown heroes of the 20th century. Amelia could hardly breathe. She called her mother, who wept at the news. "He would have never wanted the spotlight," her mom said. "But he'd be so proud that you were the one to shine it." The next few months unfolded like a dream. Amelia traveled to Colorado for the museum exhibit's launch. The helmet, now carefully preserved behind thick glass, was the first thing visitors saw when they entered. Beneath it was the photograph, the one with her grandfather and Foyt Whitmore standing side by side, and beside that, a touchscreen display told the story, narrated in Amelia's own voice. She stood quietly during the opening, watching strangers stop in front of the helmet. Some took off their hats, some stood in silence for long minutes. Others whispered to their children, explaining the kind of bravery that doesn't come with medals. And every time someone's eyes filled with tears, Amelia knew. This was the opportunity she never saw coming to give voice to those who never asked to be remembered. The documentary crew arrived shortly after. They interviewed her in the garage, the same place where it all began. The helmet had long since been transferred to the exhibit, but she showed them where she'd found it: the old crates, the chest, the faded photo albums. The cameraman paused several times, visibly emotional. And during the final take, Amelia said something that didn't just make the cut. It became the closing line of the entire segment. "We look for heroes in uniforms and statues, but sometimes they're just old men in coveralls who teach you how to fix a lawnmower and carry a whole war inside them without ever saying a word." The episode aired 2 months later. It reached millions. And that's when the third opportunity arrived. A grant. The university, together with several private donors, offered Amelia the chance to lead a community initiative to collect and preserve untold war stories across America, especially from small towns like Ashwood. She would head a team of volunteers and students, traveling to communities, interviewing elders, cataloging artifacts, and archiving first-hand accounts that might otherwise be lost forever. She called the project Voices in the Silence. It felt divine, like her grandfather had passed her a torch through time. The first family she interviewed was from a tiny town in Montana, a woman in her 90s who had once hidden 3 Jewish refugees in her barn during the war. She'd never told anyone, not even her children. But after watching Amelia's story, she finally felt brave enough to share her own. Amelia recorded everything, voice trembling, eyes full of gratitude. That woman passed away 3 weeks later. Her story, now archived and honored. And so it continued. From Maine to Mississippi, from Oregon to Oklahoma, Amelia traveled, listened, recorded, and remembered. But every road, every voice, every crackling old cassette tape brought her back to one place, the creaky old garage in Ashwood, where a helmet shouldn't have existed, where silence once lived, where truth finally found a way to speak. And that, Amelia realized, was the real opportunity all along to transform a legacy of quiet strength into a future of courageous storytelling. Because stories aren't just memories, they're bridges between past and present, between silence and truth, between a quiet old man named Walt and the world he never asked to change, but quietly, humbly, did. By autumn, the leaves around Ashwood had turned gold and ember, like the forest was on fire with memory. Amelia had returned home briefly, not to rest, but to sit in the silence where it all began. The cabin was just as she had left it. The kitchen light still flickered. The garage still smelled like rust and pine sap. But something was different now. She was different. The woman who once came back to simply sort through boxes had become a voice for hundreds, a collector of forgotten truths, a bridge between past and present. And yet, for all her traveling, recording, speaking, and honoring others, there was still one voice she hadn't faced. Her own. That night, Amelia sat at her grandfather's old workbench, the wood still marked with burns, oil stains, and the initials he had carved decades ago, WWII. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter. To Walt. Not Grandpa, not Pop, just Walt. Because she needed to speak to him as a man now, as someone she finally saw in full. She read it aloud, tears rolling freely. I thought I knew you. I thought you were just the man who made pancakes with too much syrup and who fell asleep during baseball games. I didn't know you were the reason a family still exists. I didn't know you carried someone's life inside your silence. But now I do. And I want you to know, I'm not just proud of you. I'm changed because of you. She paused, her voice cracking. Every time someone cries when they hear your story, every time a veteran says they feel seen, every time a granddaughter hugs her grandfather a little longer because of what you did. That's you, Walt. That's your legacy. And I'm going to carry it for the rest of my life. She folded the letter and placed it in the old metal drawer where he used to keep his watch and tools. Then she closed it, gently, as if tucking him in one last time. And that's when the unexpected happened. She heard a knock. Soft, hesitant. She wiped her eyes and opened the front door. A young man stood there, barely 18, shoulders hunched, eyes red. Are you the lady from the story? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, she said, surprised. I didn't know where else to go, he said, looking down. My great-grandfather, he always talked about someone helping him after the war. He'd wake up screaming sometimes. Said a man in Oregon pulled him from the wreck. We thought he was confused, delirious, but then I saw your documentary, and the helmet, and I realized. He pulled out a photo. Amelia felt her knees go weak. It was her grandfather. Again, only this time, in a different photo, younger, dirtier, standing beside another soldier she didn't recognize. The boy wiped his eyes. Your grandfather saved 2 men. My great-grandfather never forgot. Said Walt gave him the will to live. And I just wanted to say, thank you. I never met Walt, but because of him, I'm alive. Amelia couldn't speak. She reached out and hugged the boy, not out of pity, but out of shared blood, even if not by family. He left quietly, but the moment stayed with her. Walt hadn't just saved a man, he'd saved generations. That night, Amelia stood on the back porch, looking out at the woods. The trees whispered with wind, like the forest itself remembered what had happened here long ago. She whispered up to the stars, "You weren't just a man. Walt, you were the reason the story kept going." For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was grieving him. She felt like he was still working through her hands, her voice, her purpose. Amelia wasn't just telling his story anymore. She had become part of it. Spring came late to Ashwood that year. The trees were slower to bloom, as if even nature needed a little more time to process everything that had happened. But eventually, the flowers returned. The forest breathed again. And in the heart of town, something beautiful unfolded. A new plaque stood in the town square. Not grand, not flashy. Just a simple bronze rectangle on a stone base. It read, "In honor of Walter Thompson, who saved lives with his hands and changed the world with his silence. 1920, durch Tegundi Quarto." The dedication ceremony was small at Amelia's request. No media crews, no flashing lights, just a few townsfolk, a group of veterans, Matthew Whitmore, and the boy who had shown up on her doorstep weeks ago. As they stood in silence, the wind picked up through the trees, and for a moment, it felt like Walt was there, just behind them, watching, not smiling, not waving, just standing the way he always did, quietly present. Amelia stepped forward, voice calm but strong. "My grandfather never asked to be remembered," she said. "But remembering him doesn't just honor him. It honors everyone who's ever made the right choice when no one was watching. Everyone who's helped a stranger and asked for nothing in return. Everyone who's carried the weight of a story they never told because they didn't need to be the hero. They just needed to be human." Tears filled more than one pair of eyes. She continued, "We live in a world that moves fast, that shouts, that celebrates the loudest voices. But sometimes, the greatest love, the most courageous acts happen in silence, in garages, in forests, in hands that rebuild instead of destroy. That's what Walt taught me, and that's what I'll carry forward." There was no applause, just a moment of deep, still reverence. And then something unexpected happened. One by one, people from the crowd began to step forward, pulling photographs, medals, journals from their bags and pockets. Veterans spoke names of friends who never made it home. Grandchildren shared stories passed down in whispers. People Amelia had known her whole life, but never truly seen, now stood with tears in their eyes, saying, "He reminds me of my father. My grandmother did something like that too. I thought I was the only one who remembered." And it was in that moment Amelia realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of 100 others. That night, she returned to the cabin, heart full and hands shaking with the weight of all she'd heard. She lit a candle, placed it by Walt's old workbench, and whispered, "You didn't need a monument, but now, your story is helping build hundreds more." Weeks later, she launched a project called the Quiet Valor Initiative, a national archive dedicated to collecting silent acts of bravery from everyday Americans, janitors, farmers, nurses, mechanics, anyone who had done the right thing when no one was watching. It grew fast, too fast to keep up at times. But Amelia didn't mind. Because for every story that came in a mailman who smuggled medicine during the war, a factory worker who protected the children of immigrants, a teacher who hid letters of hope in her students' books, she saw another spark of her grandfather. And eventually she began to heal, not just from losing him, but from never having known this part of him before. She realized that grief is not just pain. Sometimes it's a door to understanding, to growth, to purpose. And when that grief turns into light, it can guide more people than we ever imagined. In the end, Walt Thompson never made history books, but he changed lives, and he changed her. And because of that, Amelia knew something now, something so simple and so true. Sometimes, the world is not saved by those who speak the loudest, but by those who act the kindest when no one is watching. And somewhere in the silence of that old garage, where it all began, you could almost hear a voice say, "That's enough. You've done well." Not all heroes wear medals. Some wear overalls stained with oil. Some walk silently through the world, fixing what's broken not just with their hands, but with their hearts. Walter Thompson's story reminds us that extraordinary courage can live in the most ordinary places. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't want to be remembered. But his quiet choice to save a life without ever seeking recognition rippled across generations. In a world that often celebrates noise and visibility, Walt teaches us that true impact doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through kindness, through duty, through quiet integrity. And when someone finally listens, that whisper can become a voice that changes everything. So don't underestimate your small actions. You never know whose story they might be part of someday. Because legacy isn't built by fame, it's built by love. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that prove kindness never dies. Click to keep listening, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe even quiet lives can echo forever.